Now it's recording. All right, family systems. So we'll talk about the family, working parents. A lot more parents work now than they did 2 decades ago or more than that. So with that, about 2/3 of mothers with children from 6 to 17 are in the labor force, and for children younger than that, about 50% of mothers in the U.S. are in the labor force. So this means that for, say, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, on average, about half of those children, both parents are in the workforce. Or if they're in a single parent family, that parent is in the workforce. So that means they've got less time than maybe previous generations with that parent. And so that can be a risk factor. But with this, it also can have some potential benefits. So children, especially girls, do have more egalitarian views of gender when their mother is working outside the home. The setting of the work for the parent is really important, though. So as we've talked about the systems around a person as they're developing through time. So this child, who here we're still talking about early childhood, so we're talking about ages of about 3 to 5. So with that, in early childhood, you've got the context, really even into adolescence too. The context of the work is really important. So your parents at work, if they're really stressed coming home and they just want to relax and not deal with anybody anymore, that's going to be a potential risk factor for that young person, because then their parents not going to be interacting with them. If the parents coming home really angry and then they're taking out that anger on the family, that's going to be negative. But if the work setting is not as stressful, if it's something that the parent is engaged with and enjoying, then they're coming back from work and they don't have those problems. They're not so stressed. They're able to play with a child or talk to a child or spend time with the child. They have that, you could say, mental energy to do those kinds of things. So those poor conditions can lead to more irritability at home. Positive work conditions can lead to positive benefits at home, and seeing these positive things like egalitarian views of gender. So with that, let's move on to another aspect of family systems is divorce. So 40% of children born to married parents will experience divorce. So with that being said, they do show poor adjustment, and the more divorces that they go through, the worse this is. So if you have a child who's been through 3 different divorces, their risk factors are a lot higher than a child who's just been through one divorce. And usually the main cause of these problems are the initial stages of a divorce, where there's a lot of active conflict, maybe a lot of active yelling at each other, fighting over things, versus generally, on average, towards the end of a divorce process, things are being more worked out at that point, and there's not such high tension and high stress. So those initial pieces, on average, again, some divorces can be high tension and high stress through the whole thing, and those are the things that are the worst on the children. So with this, academic problems, externalizing problems, depression, and less confidence in future relationships, these are all risk factors from a child in early childhood going through a divorce. So with that being said, should parents stay together for the sake of the children? So this is kind of a rhetorical question. I'm going to answer it in a second. I'm not really asking you to vote on it, but think about it from your own life. Maybe you've been through a divorce yourself. Maybe your parents went through a divorce. Maybe you have a close friend or family member who went through a divorce. So you can think to yourself, do I think that they should have stayed together for the sake of the children? So researchers have also asked this question to try and figure out, so there's these risk factors, but there's also these protective benefits from having multiple parents in the picture. So researchers have tried to figure out, well, in what situations should they maybe stay together? In what situations does it seem like they shouldn't? So if the stress and disruptions caused by an unhappy marriage diminish the well-being of the children, then you should maybe split. So like I said at the begin a minute ago, the anxiety, the stress, the tension in the initial stages of the divorce, if that is pretty consistent for these children, if their home environment is kind of an unsafe place and they don't have these good attachments with their parents, and so if their well-being is being diminished because of this unhappy marriage, then that might be a condition or a time when they should possibly divorce. So if there's abuse in this situation, if one of the parents are abusing the children, then researchers suggest, yeah, there probably should be a divorce in that kind of case. If there's diminished financial resources, with that increased risk of divorce, plus inept parenting. So if after the divorce the children are going to be with a parent that's more inept, that they really need to be together to be able to parent sufficiently. If there's continued conflict in the family even after the divorce, or there will be, then in those kinds of situations it might be better, yes, or abuse of the partner as well. Absolutely right. Sorry, I didn't mention that. So if there's abuse generally, yeah, definitely a situation where researchers suggest there probably should be a divorce in that kind of situation. So with that, it may be better to stay together if the situation for the child after the divorce is going to be worse off than if the parents could stay together for the sake of a child and keep the children's well-being up. So again, this is a really individual question, but these are the kinds of things that researchers have seen by studying lots of different families that have gone through divorce to try and figure out what are the biggest risk factors that would suggest maybe in these cases divorce should happen versus these cases they should not. So a researcher isn't going to say, hey, you specific family, you should not get divorced or you should get divorced. But these are the things that they've suggested. If the child is still going to have a higher well-being, and there's not high tension and high conflict with these people staying together for the sake of the children, in that kind of situation might be appropriate to stay together. So with this, like I said, most of the problems for the children, most of these risk factors come from those initial active stages of conflict. Like I said, if that continues through or even after, that can be really problematic. So it's a risk for healthy attachments. So if a child sees that their parents are no longer attached to each other, if they don't feel an attachment with one of those parents, they can go from a secure attachment to an insecure attachment. So with that, here's a good video on supporting kids through divorce. Since we already should be on chapter 7, I'll just have this here in the slides that you can watch. It has a couple good tips basically about co-parenting. We make a couple of those points here, but it goes into a little more detail. So after the divorce, and again specifically this is for early children, what are things that can help those children in early childhood? We'll come back to divorce in I forget if it's early adulthood or middle adulthood, and we'll talk about divorce again, more from the context of the people that are getting the divorce. So authoritative parenting leads to more positive outcomes. So it's one of the most positive parenting styles in general for a lot of different groups. So it does seem to be very useful after the divorce as well. So this is each individual parent and then also co-parenting. So the individual factors of a child are important too. So their personality, their temperament, their own adjustment play a role. So things like therapy can really help for that family and for that child to build skills and coping mechanisms and to be able to have fewer of these risk factors. So with that, that is really brief on divorce and the family and divorce. So with this, there's not a lot of detail on cross-cultural studies and family systems, which is kind of a strange thing because family is one core aspect of the context in development. So you've got a child, you've got them interacting generally with their family as one of the primary contact points. So there's not as much detail in the book. There's not as much research cross-culturally as there really should be. So a good area for additional research if that's something that you're interested in. There are researchers, for example, who focus specifically on one or two different cultural contexts. So if that's relevant to you, if you come from a family with a different cultural context and that's something that you would want to research and learn more about, one, doing a question paper on it would be a good idea. And two, if you wanted to in the future continue to do research on that topic, it's a good thing to do as well. So with this, rural areas do tend to have more authoritarian parenting. Many places in the world have more than one generation living with children. So rather than having just parents and children in one home, there might be grandparents, parents, children, or aunts and uncles, more family members within maybe a small geographic area like a neighborhood or a single household. So in many, many places in the world, there's a lot more family members essentially to rely on for the children. So they might have their parents and their grandparents and a couple aunts or uncles available to be having bidirectional interactions with. Versus, I mean, right now it's a pandemic, so children aren't really seeing much of their family other than like video calls like this. Um, they they have very few like aunts and uncles close by, um, so they don't have that direct interaction as many people in the world do. With this, smaller families do tend to have more open communication, so across cultures. With this, similarly, ethnically, we see a lot, even in the U.S., with various ethnicities, larger families and extended families in close proximity are more common. So that's, again, more interacting with other members of the family, more resources for a child, more supports for each member of that family as well. So that's a really good protective factor to have many family members that can or are supportive to an individual, to the parents, to the children, to each other. It's a really good thing. So another problem, though, risk factor, is that a lot of ethnic minorities tend to be lower SES. And so that comes from a lot of historical, political things that have happened all throughout history to keep ethnic minorities in lower SESs. So this risk factor is a really big deal. And it's something that can be protected against by parents individually by working to find schools, community groups, and supports for their children. But then we're putting a lot of responsibility on those individuals, on those individual parents. So that is one thing parents individually can do, but the community context can also do a lot more by providing those kinds of supports for people. And these can be accessed by ethnic minority groups or all groups in the area. So additional supports for children, for families, better. The more supports you have, the better protective factors, essentially. So with that being said, I know we're really breezing through these really quickly. And this slide really completely irrelevant to the conversation, but Family System is a Chevelle song. It's my favorite band. Here it is. If you want to listen to it after class, go for it. It's from one of their earlier albums. They've gotten better since then, but I like pretty much all their songs. And they have a new album coming out in 10 days, so I'm pretty excited about that. Right before my birthday, so it's a birthday present to myself for sure. Anyway, probably spent way more time on that than I should have. Yeah, I'm excited. All right, so other socio-emotional topics specifically in early childhood here. Again, we're going to go really quickly through. So play, again, really big part. Early children should be playing a lot. A lot of their social interactions, a lot of their cognitive development is happening through play. I mean, a silly kind of similar situation you see in animals. A lot of mammals do a lot of play to learn the skills that they need in their environment. So lions, baby lions will attack each other and stalk each other. Children will play, will cooperate, will sometimes fight, will make up, will pretend, will take on roles that parents take and try out different roles, play house, play school, do other kinds of things. And this is really good for their development. So allowing them to play is really good, giving them space to play. So here's a couple descriptions of play: sensory motor and practice play that builds senses, so eyes, ears, nose, and motor skills. So practice play is repetitive behavior of new skills, so practicing building blocks or building Legos. As they get a little older, practicing doing things like math. So symbolic play, using objects as stand-ins for other objects. So a ball might become a Pikachu. So this yellow ball is Pikachu. This brown one is an Eevee or something like that. That's symbolic play. And that helps with thinking abstractly. And you don't really see that until they're starting to be able to think abstractly in that way. You might be able to play with a younger child and say, hey, let's pretend this one is a Pikachu and this one is an Eevee or something like that. But they probably won't before about this time, so closer to age 4 or 5, they probably won't be making those connections themselves and thinking abstractly on their own. All right, social play, play with peers. Constructive play combines a lot of things. So in a lot of classrooms, you will see, especially in preschool, kindergarten, first grade classrooms, they'll do some combination of like learning while playing. So that's essentially what constructive play is. So media and screen time. This is the last topic, but it's really, really relevant. So children have a lot of easier access to technology. Honestly, these slides I should have probably updated with some of the more recent research about screen time during this pandemic, especially. So children are watching a whole lot more TV than is probably good for them. So with that being said, parents and teachers, people can, caregivers, grandparents, can choose better kinds of programs to help children learn rather than just entertain. With that, the Pediatrics Association recommends less than an hour of TV per day. I know we probably do more than that generally. With active programs can have positive benefits, things that the child can interact with, which there's certain kinds of video games that they could play that can do that kind of thing, where they can interact with learning material and it will change. Other shows might ask a child a question or to find something on the screen. That kind of interaction is a lot better for a child's media consumption. If they have something that is just entertaining, they have a higher likelihood of becoming more passive learners in the future. Again, there's developmental plasticity. This can be fixed later on. But passive learning is not as good as active learning. So with this, models on TV might not demonstrate appropriate socio-emotional skills. So a lot of parents that I know really hate the show Caillou, for example. It's a lot of it's trying to teach socio-emotional skills, but it's not as good as maybe say if you've not seen children's TV, these examples might mean nothing to you. Daniel Tiger is a really good example because even though Daniel Tiger might have a negative reaction, the focus of it is a lot of times on how to deal with those kinds of negative emotions, being disappointed or being angry versus Caillou. He tantrums a lot, and so that can kind of model inappropriate socio-emotional skills to a child. So picking the kind of content that's better for them. Another really good thing is to talk to the child about what they're watching. So my son was watching Superwhy a little bit ago, and so I got to talk to him about the letters, trying to find letters around the room or on a page. They've got magnets, like letter magnets, on the fridge. So trying to point out where the letter A is, for example, that kind of thing. So these are some examples of pretty good shows for early children that have more interactivity. So Daniel Tiger is a really good one for a lot of socio-emotional skills. Superwhy is a lot for reading skills. You've got like letter recognition here. So those kinds of things that are more interactive can be really good. So maybe you can find, these are just a couple examples. There's actually a lot of research. Actually, one of the most, probably the most researched TV show ever is actually Sesame Street. So it started out, it was one of the first children's shows that was trying to use developmental research to create programming. And so they do evaluations and studies of it all the time to see if it's getting at the kids that they're wanting to get, building skills, building socio-emotional skills. How can we get skills for kids that are neurodivergent? So there's a lot of research on Sesame Street. So if you wanted to do a question paper on Sesame Street, you would have a hard time picking between all the hundreds of papers, honestly, to answer your question. But there's a lot of content there about Sesame Street and a lot of research, which is pretty interesting, I think. All right, so I know some of that was really hurried and really rushed. Before we jump into Chapter 7, is there anything that I touched on here at the end of Chapter 6 with divorce, with play, and with media consumption for early children that you want me to dive into a little bit more, since I just breezed through a lot of it? or questions that you have. All right, if that is the case, let's move on to chapter 7 then. So chapter 7, we're moving on to the next stage of childhood. We're now in middle and late childhood. So some books will, for example, squish middle childhood and squish late childhood and focus on those. We're kind of combining both those two time periods, which I think is fine, especially with the weeks that we have to cover each of these topics. So let's talk about physical development, and then we'll get to cognitive development. Probably cognitive development will be next class period. But I do want to kind of breeze through some of the physical development stuff. There's a couple that are really relevant for a lot of psychology, but these general changes in size, I feel like they're good to know, so you can know if you're working with children what to be what's expected, but also it's not. Yeah, that's about it. So 2 to 3 inches a year in height, 5 to 7 pounds a year in weight. Most of this weight gain is coming from skeleton growing and muscles growing and organs growing rather than from fat. So the body itself, the skeletons are getting more dense, the organs themselves are growing, most of them. The brain's not really growing that much. It's pretty close already to full adult size, but a lot of muscles are growing. So that's what most of this size and weight difference is coming from. So with this being said, in middle and late childhood, so middle and late childhood, generally from 6 to 11, 6 to 13, there's a little bit of disagreement on when adolescence begins. Some people will say it's as early as 12 or as late as, say, 14. So 13 is a pretty good average number there, is when late childhood is ending. Which is a hard thing because puberty has been happening earlier and earlier on average. So it's hard to say, hey, this is still late childhood if some children are entering puberty in late childhood. That's just one aspect of the debate there of when late childhood ends. So one critical thing here is realizing that kids at around 6 to up to about 12, their bones are getting harder. So my son's 4, his bones are still really bendy. So when he jumps off a couch and crashes to the ground, his bones do a good job of still flexing a little bit. Versus my older child is here in the middle childhood stages. They both have jumping off a bed or a couch and tripping and falling or falling out of a tree is a pretty high risk in and of itself. But you do see more bones being broken in middle to late childhood because their bones are now a little stiffer, and so rather than flexing, they will break. So with this brain development, we have about 90% of our adult brain weight at age 6. Then by about age 10, we're very close to full weight of the brain. So with this, the dendrites, again, can still be pruned, can still be added, so we can make a lot of connections still. But essentially everything's there, all the supporting structure, the fluids that are there. At the end of late childhood, we're very, very similar structure-wise to what we see in adults, but then there's still myelination happening. So the prefrontal cortex is doing a lot of specializing here. As you can tell, this is one of our favorite things to talk about in development and this class, because the prefrontal cortex ties so many things together. So gross motor skills and fine motor skills are becoming a lot better, a lot smoother. Most kids at age 11 at the end of late childhood are really good with both gross and fine motor skills. Boys are usually outperforming girls in gross motor skills, and girls are usually outperforming boys in fine motor skills. A lot of that fine motor skill is probably coming from myelination within the neurons. So allowing those messages to be sent quicker and easier for the fine motor movements of fingers. So fine motor skills are really important for things like playing instruments or building fine things like a Lego creation. As you can tell, I I enjoy Lego. It's fun. So handwriting also can improve as well. With this, with all these things being said and talking about how important play was in early childhood, it's also really important in middle and late childhood too. So one thing that we're finding is that children through the whole childhood are not getting as much exercise as they should be getting. So children at this age, from middle to late childhood, should have about an hour of moderate to vigorous physical activity a day. So there are lots of ways to get this. So by actually doing a kind of exercise program. So this kid actually wanted to learn the skills of Bruce Lee, and so just one specific example did exercises specifically for that. If a kid's interested in an activity, letting them do that physical activity. Soccer, frisbee, running, climbing, those kinds of things. So supporting their interests in a way that they can have more physical active activities. Playing together with peers, games, team sports. There's a lot of ways to get their exercise that isn't how I exercise, just sitting in front of a TV doing a workout program. Although if children in middle and late childhood see an adult doing an exercise program, they might want to join in. Depending on what it is, it might or might not be super safe for them. So lifting big weights over their heads before they have all the gross motor capacity to do that and control them well, probably not a good idea. So with this, there's a lot of cognitive benefits to exercise, both in middle and late childhood, as well as throughout life. So attention, executive function, academic achievement, inhibition control, working memory, all seem to improve because of exercise. So there's a lot of studies on exercise that show this causal relationship, that a lot of these cognitive functions can improve because of exercising. So it's really, really good to get in this kind of pattern, especially doing something that is play for a child in middle and late childhood, that is getting them physically active. So modeling is very important for this. A child who has seen a parent exercising is far more likely to exercise in their adulthood than one who did not see their parents exercising. So PE in schools, there are studies of PE showing that it has been successful at improving fitness and lowering fat, especially for overweight children. So what are middle and late children doing instead of being active? So this isn't a rhetorical one. This is actually a question for the class. So in the chat or on your mic, what do you think children in middle and late childhood are doing instead of being active? Yeah, so we're getting a lot of variations of the same answer, essentially. So we've got video games, screen time, TV. Yeah, these are the things that children in middle, late, and late childhood are doing, just like we were talking about early childhood, more than they really should be for their cognitive, physical, and socio-emotional development. So whether it's video games, whether it's watching TV, they're having a lot of screen time rather than being physically active. So getting them interested in something for play that they will be physically active in, that's probably one of the best things. So even though, for example, when it was kind of snowy the other day, but my children were both like, "Hey, we want to ride our bikes." I didn't want to go out and ride bikes. I wanted to stay in the warmth. But I went out and had them ride their bikes anyway. They ended up getting too cold and coming in pretty quickly anyway. So, but it was it was good to get them physically moving and exercising. Um, Instead, we played inside and ran around and things like that and terrorized cats. So that can work for my kids. But yeah, kids are spending a lot more time doing screen time. And I feel personally called out. I picked this picture because we had that specific device and we're giving them to our kids. And then the devices broke. One, because it got thrown, and then by a child, and the other one of my children just banged the screen with a rock just to see what would happen, and it broke it. So they learned that banging screens with rocks is not good. And it was literally like a week and a half past its like, for any reason this breaks, we will replace it thing. So a week and a half after that. So that was frustrating, but then less screen time. So that was a positive. So overweight children in both the US and China on average have been overweight at increasing rates. This isn't as much of a problem in some other countries and cultures, but these two specific countries, we've seen a high increase in obesity rates. So with this, heredity is really important here. So as we talked about, in very, very early childhood and infancy, a lot of physical growth is dependent on heredity. And then the next biggest factor is nutrition. So heredity is a risk or a preventative factor. If parents are overweight, their kids are much more likely, so they have a higher probability to be overweight. So if you think of developmental cascades, if they have a high probability of being overweight, if they have less access to nutritious foods, maybe they're in something like a food desert, if they have their own personal choice preferences for things that are not as healthy, higher likelihood that they will be overweight. So some things that can affect this in the environment are mealtime regularity. So this can be difficult for some families who have multiple parents working at very different times, or different caregivers on different schedules, but having a regular set mealtime is very useful. Having meal times, sitting down at a table like at the same place, so more routine meal times can be helpful as well. So having less screen time can help with not being as overweight. Schools that offer or emphasize healthy foods are really good. I am really curious, for a lot of schools during the pandemic have had their food programs kind of expanded to send food home with people. I'm really curious to see if there's any research now or in, say, 6 months or so on the effects of that for obesity in children. Because I do suspect that providing these other healthy foods to some families might have a positive impact. But yeah, I'll be interested to see that. I haven't actually searched, but I suspect, given how long it takes for psych research to go through the publication process, probably about now is the earliest we would see some of this research in psych work. If we want to look just at medical focused outcomes, there's probably some research already published. Different variables, different ways the fields do the publication process leads a lot of medical research to come out a little quicker than psych research. All right, so 55 or more minutes of physical activity a day, really important. So hypertension, higher blood cholesterol, and obesity in adolescence and adulthood, these are all risk factors of obesity in children. So these are all really important. So one of the highest causes of death is high blood pressure. So keeping that risk down early and keeping that down over the lifetime is really, really useful to help prevent early death, and a lot of other health complications as well. So this is a good video on some other supports. We've touched on a couple of them. It goes into some in more detail. So let's do that now.
The ultimate answer to the childhood obesity epidemic is to deal with what's been called our toxic environment, with junk food everywhere, advertising of unhealthful products to kids, inadequate opportunities for physical activity. But that's going to be a long-term prospect. We can begin to protect our children immediately in one environment through which we have 100% control, and that's the home. Parents can use very basic behavioral change practices to begin to guide their children to a healthy lifestyle right away. And that's, in fact, the focus of the work that we do in the Optimal Weight for Life, or the OWL program at Children's Hospital Boston. The two key parenting practices, really at any age, are called protecting the home environment, and modeling. Protecting the home environment simply means if it doesn't support health, don't bring it in the home. You can say no once to your kids when they're asking you for that gallon of ice cream in the supermarket, or you can try to say no every night when they're nagging you for it if it's sitting in the freezer. The same also applies to physical activity. Let's not have a high-definition, widescreen television in every room. Let's put opportunities for physical activity, active games. Kids can close the doors, have fun, and enjoy themselves. A second key parenting practice is called modeling. And the idea here is that if you do it, they'll do it. But the opposite is also true. If you don't do it, they won't do it. When parents are eating well and engaging in a physically active lifestyle, they'll be modeling the right behaviors for the overweight or obese child, and the parents' own cardiovascular risk factors improve. All too often, parents resort to negative practices like nagging, punishment, criticism. Very common for parents to try to force their kids to eat foods that they think are healthy, like fruits and vegetables, or excessively restrict other foods like candy. But these practices tend to backfire. They make the kid dislike fruits and vegetables and actually crave those restricted foods even more. Instead, we encourage practices like praise, goal setting, self-monitoring, something we call empowerment, where kids actually participate in food preparation, even food selection. And we have a saying that if they cook it, or if they select it in the store, they'll probably eat it. Many parents are working multiple jobs, leaving little time to shop for and prepare foods at home. Also, especially in some inner city communities, fast food is cheap and available, and nutritious food ingredients like fruits and vegetables can be very expensive or literally unavailable. Yet another factor is that children are under a lot of stress, almost ridiculously early in life. Young children are under academic pressures to exceed in scholastic studies, and this can not only limit time for being outdoors, playing, and relaxing, but also put so much stress on a young child that it influences their eating habits. They may turn to food for comfort, and obesity is the almost unavoidable consequence.
So we've touched on a couple of those, but went into more detail in that video on a couple other things that can be done. One thing that I do wish would happen is, as a researcher, as a parent, you can't. It's hard to think big picture, like, hey, let's change the system, because changing the system is more difficult and more long term, takes more cooperation between people. But if we change the system so that kids who don't have those kinds of foods available have them available, so kids have more time and more resources, things like that, are things that we should be focusing on as well. Some of those factors, he didn't mention in there what ages of children, but like the planning and cooking foods, obviously as they get older into middle and late childhood, that's more possible, being able to select a food, things like that. In earlier childhood, cognitive decision making, they're not really weighing decisions we talked about, they're kind of just picking something. So it's not as relevant in early childhood, but in later childhood it is. So a lot of good things there. Questions about any of that? As you type any questions, there's one comment that he made in there that I don't think we have in the slides at all. I don't think it's in this textbook as well. But one interesting finding is there's a lot of research on education and a lot of research on homework, and homework specifically for kindergarten, elementary, middle, high school. And essentially what the findings are, just in brief, are that homework for children just really shouldn't exist. So in a school context setting, or in a school time setting, whether it's at home or at a school, having all the schoolwork done in that time for that space, and then having time at home for things like play, for time for eating, that leads to the most optimal outcomes. Kids that are coming home, kids and early teenagers really, coming home with a lot of homework is really not appropriate for their academic, cognitive, socio-emotional development. So really, we shouldn't be having much homework until we're getting to about high school time. And at high school time, at that point, maybe the end of middle school, depending. So the kind of cutoff there is a little fuzzy still. More research is being done, but by high school, that's about the appropriate time to be bringing homework home. So that's doing a half hour, 2 hours of homework at that time. Before that time, especially in childhood and elementary school, there really shouldn't be any homework coming home. So one of the things that my daughter brings home is a reading page. She's supposed to do so many minutes of reading, and she's supposed to do one page to timer and see how much she improves over time. That is appropriate, like having children go home and doing reading, but giving them a whole workbook to also do when they get home, that's really inappropriate for children, is what researchers have found. So there's a good comment here. Homework is a constant struggle with my kids, and that's one of the other factors with it too. So having how many hours of school? So like 6 hours, where, I mean, some of that time they're playing and active, doing recess, doing socio-emotional skills, but a lot of that time is devoted to learning specific academic things. And so keeping it within those hours is a lot better than bringing home additional hours, especially for early childhood, all the way through elementary school, even most of middle school. It would actually be better to have no homework. And part of this goes to, what are we asking schools to do? Are we putting too much responsibilities on schools to do other skills for children? What is the balance here? What does the training teachers have as well? So if teachers were trained to give a lot of homework, that's probably what they're going to do. Most teachers don't have time to keep up, and don't necessarily need to get recertified and keep up with the most up-to-date research that says, well, hey, the homework isn't actually helping. So it's not building skills faster than keeping it all in school. So that's not to say if your child who is 10 has homework, just have them not do it. You're the parent or caregiver. That's up to you. Talk to the teacher. At one point, we did have a talk with a teacher saying, hey, we'll do this much, but with it taking this many hours after school, we're not going to do all these kinds of worksheets. And then the next year in school, she had a different teacher that didn't send home any homework, things like that. So the teacher probably didn't like us because we're like challenging their teaching. We probably sounded a lot like Karens doing that, but there is a lot of research that shows that homework doesn't really improve for most children. So this is, again, on average for most children. The specific needs of any individual child might be different. Maybe having that learning supported at home for any individual child might be really useful. But if you're interested in that topic, let me know. I can send you some papers on this as well. Probably spent too much time already on it. Basic point, probably should be no homework in elementary school, and really not till middle school. Reading at home, or encouraging reading at home, that can be good. Or if they like doing math, if math is something fun for them, encouraging those things that they find fun and doing on their own time, giving them workbooks if that's something that they want to do, not forcing them to sit down and do another half hour of math or something like that if that's not something that they're interested in. My daughter really likes reading. Her cousin really likes math. So their parents, for his birthday, gave him a big math workbook. So he's basically doing another hour of math at home, but enjoying it. It's not homework. It's not required. It's not a fight. So having that kind of constant struggle is one of those additional pieces that brings more stress into the home environment and puts it at more risk factors. All right, so with this, learning disabilities. So difficulty learning in regards to understanding spoken or written language. And so we're only going to touch on a couple here and only dive into depth with a few. with the time we have, before we jump into this, let's actually take a quick break. Let's say 9:24. Let's come back from a quick break. All right, I'm back a little bit early. Oh, there we go. 9:24. So let's continue on. Hopefully you had time to get to the bathroom, get a little snack as we come in and get a little bit further in chapter 7. So learning disabilities. This goes also into that discussion on education. There is a lot of research on each of these different learning disabilities. So let me know if you're having trouble finding things. In some of these cases, if you have a really specific question, the more specific your question with these, it can be harder to find the answer. But you're learning those skills to go about searching for research articles, those kinds of things. So if you need help or some pointers, let me know. All right. With these, any of these kinds of learning disabilities oftentimes stem from problems in either listening, thinking, reading, writing, or spelling. So some of them come from some of these problems with, say, reading or listening come from neurological differences in the children. So we'll talk about some of these. So the most common problem that is seen and then worked on is problems with reading. So dyslexia jumps right into that, is a severe impairment in the ability to read and spell. So with that dyslexia, oftentimes the experience of it is seeing, like perceiving letters not moving or not being in their same place, flipping, seeing words out of order. Usually it's more like down to the actual letters themselves. So dysgraphia is similar. It's some of the same neurological functions, so the same neurodivergences, making it so handwriting is difficult, making it hard to match sounds and letters. So like the actual visuals of those letters is difficult for these people and children. And dyscalculia, did I pronounce it right? Dyscalculia? I might have pronounced that wrong. Is essentially dyslexia, but for numbers specifically, as well as like the symbols used in math. And so you could think this might not be one that you've heard of before, but essentially it's the same kind of thing as dyslexia, but specifically for math. Oftentimes people who have dyslexia will also have dyscalculia, but sometimes people will just be having dyscalculia. I feel like I'm putting an extra L in there, but that's okay. So with that, it makes it hard to do math. If you're looking at a number and it's looking different than it actually is to you, then that can be really difficult to do your math and get the correct answer there. So this is not all, these neurological differences aren't located in just one part of the brain. There's a lot of different areas for reading, for writing, for doing math that are working at the same time. So there's a couple specific areas that are more common for each type of these that are maybe working differently, but it's integrating multiple informations from multiple regions of the brain. So it's not like a brain injury or something at this specific part of the brain led to dyslexia. Usually it's the brain just working slightly differently, processing things from one or more parts of the brain. So interventions often focus on improving reading ability, and intensive instruction helps. And for a lot of these different things with neurodivergence, so when someone has a neurodivergent thing like a disability like dyslexia, there's a bunch of research on a bunch of different skills and tasks and training techniques that could be used to support that person, both as a child and then also as adolescent and an adult. Definitely more research on things to support in childhood though. So with that being said, intensive instruction and having one-on-one instruction can be really helpful for all these different things with neurodivergence to figure out what works for this specific individual. And I mean, that would be, if we think about scaffolding and that general sociocultural learning theory, this is true for any person, even a neurotypical person, is that if you find exactly the best way that they learn, they're going to learn better, quicker, probably be more engaged because it's coming to them more easily. So same for someone who's neurodivergent. It's really important to find which of these specific skills or techniques work for that individual. So individualized therapy, individualized teaching, IEPs we'll talk about in a little bit, so that teachers know, hey, these kind of specific things can help with children, with this child, can be really useful. Also for someone that is neurodivergent, knowing those things even in adulthood is really helpful to me to know how to like go about planning my work and things like that. So speaking of my neurodivergence, ADHD. So with this, there's basically three critical components that lead generally to a diagnosis of ADHD. So inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. A lot of times the hyperactivity and impulsivity are what is most commonly seen, especially in childhood, in the school kind of setting. to be able to then diagnose it. But inattention is also very common too. So inattention is difficulty focusing on one thing, might be getting bored or stay on task a few minutes, not being able to attend to one specific thing and jumping to others. You might have noticed that in my discussing with things, that sometimes I jump to a tangent that has caught my interest from maybe a video we just watched that I wasn't planning to talk about homework in schools, but my attention went there. It's still relevant to lifespan development, definitely more so than Chevelle album. That was pre-planned though, the Chevelle one. So hyperactivity, high levels of physical activity. You might say a child is constantly in motion, and especially in early, middle, late childhood, it's really common for children to be very physically active. A lot of the contexts traditionally that we've kind of tried to put them in, like sitting in a desk for a long time, isn't really great for children in general, but especially not for someone with a little bit of neurodivergence and more hyperactivity. And then impulsivity, difficulty curbing actions or reactions, might not seem to think before acting. So again, this is something that is pretty common because that prefrontal cortex is still developing. They're still figuring out regulation of emotion. They're still practicing it. Some kids are going to be highly skilled at this. Some kids are going to be less skilled at this. So this isn't uncommon as well, just in a neurotypical child in middle or late childhood. So if you see these kinds of symptoms in a child that you're teaching or a child that you have or a child that you know, doesn't necessarily mean that they have ADHD. So getting a clinical diagnosis for any of these would require being able to see a consistent pattern of these appearing and negatively impacting life in some way. So their well-being, their ability to continue on in school. Maybe it's just that specific teacher that they're having trouble with. The teacher doesn't give them enough breaks or something, and something as simple as that might help support that child. So some of these symptoms are pretty typical of neurotypical children as well. So for that clinical diagnosis, you definitely need to be seeing it affect some other aspects of their development as well. So with that, 9 times more boys than girls are diagnosed with ADHD. There's also some disagreement about the reasons for increasing frequencies of diagnosis. So one of the students says, I have ADHD, but it was controlled with medications when I was 7. Would you mind sharing, are you still using medications now? Did you also go through therapy? That's one of the things we're going to talk about in a minute. So maybe just in the chat box, if you did do like some cognitive behavioral training, or if the medication has continued, because some people with ADHD that have used medications in childhood, as they get into adulthood, part of it can be the brain finishing its development of that prefrontal cortex, also learning skills and abilities, whether it's specifically through therapy or on personal trying to figure out how to work with that neurodivergence. So different people experience that differently, and some people need that medication their whole life, some people don't. So if you're comfortable sharing any about that would be great.
Yeah, there's no problem without it. But yeah, I had to take, I think, Concerta. I think that's the medication it's called, for like about 1 year or 2 years. And then after that, I was just fine. And my parents had to like sign me up for like classes for like, especially for Taekwondo. It gives me like a lot of discipline, and like that helped me a lot with my ADHD. And sometimes I still have like sequels. I like very hyperactive in mornings, then I try to stay focused in school, and then at nights I'm still like super hyperactive. So it's like 100% active all day, and which I like it a lot, to be honest. Honestly, like it's like a disability, but I like it. But yeah, it was controlled, and sometimes I do have problems with school, like focusing, but I'm able to like cope with it, and I'm fine with that, with this.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. For people who are neurodivergent, this is one of the things I don't like about it. It still is classified as a disability in the DSM-5, so the Diagnostics Statistics Manual for all kinds of disorders, it still is classified as a disability. But like you said, you've learned some skills and abilities and some discipline. So even though you might have some symptoms in the morning, then you have a time period where you can focus, then you still have some of those symptoms. It's not really impacting your life negatively now because of some of those skills that you've learned. It's a difference in how your brain works than a neurotypical person. And so you're neurodivergent. I'm neurodivergent in a similar way as well, diagnosed with ADHD in childhood. As well. I had medications in childhood. I went to therapy. So rather than something like Taekwondo, I learned skills like face-to-face with a therapist that I tried out and kind of figured out this worked for me. So it sounds like the skills that you learned through, say, Taekwondo and other things have worked for you. And so you can manage those kinds of symptoms. Yeah, that's a word that I do want to kind of get out there in the world more, is neurodivergence, because a lot of people are neurodivergent, and so their brains just work a little bit differently than a neurotypical person. So figuring out how your brain works and how it can be good for you as well, things that someone with ADHD might be able to focus on and get really passionate about and engage with in more detail, that's something that we can support. Because that's how a person's brain works a little bit differently with ADHD. So thank you for sharing that personal experience there. Let's jump to, also with that, some of the behaviors that we see from children are often seen as maybe this is ADHD. This is one reason clinical diagnoses are important. And with that, medicine can be very helpful. There's a bunch of different kinds of medicines. I have a question, my example question paper I wrote was on Ritalin for this reason. It was something that my parents were scared to give me because at the time they were hearing a lot that, oh, Ritalin will make a person more likely to get addicted to methamphetamines. So that wasn't actually a risk factor. Over time, they saw no increase of that risk, but it does have an increased risk of lower body weight for a child taking Ritalin. So for me, myself, probably good that I didn't take Ritalin in childhood because I was already lower weight than average. But yeah, so interesting things that we can find through doing that research and question papers. So with this, there might be a genetic tendency to have this neurodivergence of ADHD. The prefrontal cortex development is important. So we have seen for especially children as well as adults with ADHD, there does seem to be fewer connections or less thick myelination as well. So less myelination than a neurotypical brain. And so also getting into adulthood, finishing up the myelination while you still might have less myelination in adulthood than a neurotypical person. It's better than it was, say, when you were an adolescent or a child. So that can also help reduce some of those negative symptoms. Also, the learning how your own brain works and how you can learn and how you can work with your brain is very helpful as well. So neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin might play a role as well. A lot of the medicines for ADHD affect dopamine and serotonin. For example, a lot of antidepressants are used for ADHD, and so that might seem counterintuitive to use something like an antidepressant or Ritalin, a stimulant, for ADHD, but it can help balance some of those or change some of the neurotransmitters in the brain so that it's working a little closer to maybe a neurotypical child's. Yeah, we just talked about this. Behavior management is very helpful in combinations with drugs. Learning skills and how your own brain is processing the information. Neurofeedback is what that's called. And this is relevant for anyone that is neurodivergent, is figuring out how your brain processes info so that you can then take info in a different way or choose classes at times that are relevant to you. So if you work well in the morning or well in the evening, taking classes during that time. If you can pick or craft jobs for yourself, that's not always possible. Sometimes the job's like a specific number of hours at this time with only these breaks. But if you're able to pick something that works with how your brain works, it's going to set you up for a little bit more success. Mindfulness can be really useful for anyone with ADHD as well, for helping mind. I don't think we actually talked about it in this class, but mindfulness meditation is essentially trying to not hold on to ideas as they come. So if you're sitting there, you're being mindful and you're meditating, you're kind of letting ideas pass. You're not grabbing onto them. You're focusing on one thing. Maybe it's a sound or a candle. A tone of a bell is what I use a lot of the time, and a lot of people use. Your breath is what a lot of people use as well. So focus on the sensation of your breathing, and as something else comes into your mind, you kind of let it come and then go. So if you're being mindful and you're meditating and you think, oh, my car needs a service at this time, rather than focusing on that, let it kind of go away by itself. So I kind of think of them as idea bubbles or clouds that kind of just fade away as meditating. That can be really helpful. Physical exercise can be really helpful as well. Aerobic exercise. So you probably had with Taekwondo, some of those behavior management skills were taught to you in that as well, some of that physical activity as well. And a lot of that could still be useful today. So let's also talk about another aspect of neurodivergence, autism spectrum disorders. So with this, these are on a spectrum, and generally these classifications have been kind of set up from what is closest to neurotypical to what is furthest away from neurotypical. So if you hear someone say that their child has severe autism, what that really means is they're probably saying that their child's brain is working further away from neurotypical. Versus if someone says, my child has mild autism, what they're probably saying in their own words is they're trying to say they're closer to neurotypical. Asperger's disorder is considered by many people to be more neurotypical, even though a lot of the symptoms are the same. The way the brain is working is very similar to someone with another aspect of autism. So with this, there's generally, for all these autism spectrum disorders, there's generally lower levels of executive functioning in working memory. And so we've talked about working memory, and we'll go into it in more detail in this chapter. Probably won't get to it till, no, definitely with the time we have now. We definitely won't get to it till next time. But with that, the lower level of executive function, especially in working memory, can make it difficult to think neurotypically. So the thinking process is different for someone with an autism spectrum disorder. So this is usually identified in early and middle childhood. There's a lot of research being done trying to identify the signs and correlates of autism, even as in children as early as 2. I mean, when you see that such and such is common in 50% of children with autism, then that could be a risk factor. And it's not bad to have intensive interventions for any child, whether they're a neurodivergent child or a neurotypical child. Having one-on-one instruction and figuring out how your brain works is going to be helpful for any child. There is the stigma with a labeled disorder. So if someone knows you have depression or autism or ADHD, there is a stigma with all of those for some people. So that can be a negative outcome from having a diagnosis, but having that individualized attention and focus on the child can be really good. So autistic disorder is considered a severe developmental disorder. Oftentimes there's abnormalities in communication, oftentimes restricted or repetitive patterns of behaviors, and this can affect social relationships poorly. So if the communication is difficult, so there we've got a comment, found out that nephew has autism yesterday and he is too. Yeah, so this is something that hopefully with that diagnosis, there can be individualized attention. A good thing maybe to suggest to that family is looking into studies or also maybe some videos of neurodivergence with autism to figure out how specifically that child's brain is working and how you can build a more supportive environment in the home. Because really with any of these neurodivergences, the brain's not necessarily going to work in a neurotypical manner. The communication, you might not be able to change a child who has autism disorder to communicate in the exact same way as someone who's neurotypical. But if everybody can learn to communicate with them and have a positive relationship with them, even if that communication is a little different than it might be for other people that are more neurotypical, that's really positive too. So being encouraging. Another aspect of stigma of diagnosis is that can be really scary for the parents. They can be really worried about it. What do I do? Sometimes parents can even feel like they're a failure. There are like genetic factors that might lead to increased risk, but it's not like they caused this or it's their fault, but they might sometimes feel that way. So just a couple ideas, especially since this is such a new thing, finding out that the nephew has autism yesterday. And they're so young. These are some things that you might recommend, and also the parents might be experiencing. With that, especially for a 2-year-old, think back to the neurotypical development cognitively and socioemotionally. A 2-year-old still needs to play, interact, have social interactions. So this is a really good time for the parents to learn how to communicate with the child. The child's probably going to be communicating a little differently than they might have expected. So they might have had some expectations of how that child will communicate. They're neurodivergent, so they might never communicate in that exact specific way. But especially at the age of 2, they have a good chance to be able to, even if they have abnormal, so not typical communication, they can learn how to communicate with that child, give them support, figuring out what they need, be responsive. These things are all still really important, especially for a child that young. So Asperger's syndrome, a lot of people with this have relatively good verbal language skills. This is why a lot of people see it as less neurodivergent. They see it as closer to neurotypical. They can hold a conversation a little better. Things like that. So they still do have a lot of the nonverbal language problems, like picking up on nonverbal cues that people with other autism spectrum disorders have, often still do have repetitive routines or preoccupations with certain subjects. One client that I worked with who was 12 or 13 at the time had a really big preoccupation with bugs. Were they bugs? So it's the kind of bugs that live in hives, like termites, ants, bees. Really had a preoccupation with that specific subject, as an example. And he was neurodivergent in this way. So communicated a lot of ways that way. Sometimes made metaphors of himself to members of those kinds of creature community. So that was a little tough at first because that's the way he was communicating. I had to learn, well, what is the role of the drone within a hive or something like that. So once I learned that and understood, oh, this is what he's saying about himself, that communication, for example, just in this one specific instance, was a lot more clear. So abnormalities in brain structure and neurotransmitters, again, lack of connectivity between brain areas, genetic factors, all these different things are probably working together to cause autism spectrum disorders. Essentially, the brain is working differently. That's why we call it neurodivergent. So neurologically, there's differences. It's divergent from the neurotypical. It's working a little different. So we shouldn't necessarily expect someone with any kind of neurodivergence to be neurotypical or to display themselves as neurotypical, but we should be able to know and communicate well with them, build society in a way that's inclusive of them as well. So IEPs are one way to do that. It's an individualized education plan. I wanted to talk more about it than we have time, but essentially it's a written statement or contract that you work with the therapist, the schools, the parents to figure out, well, this is what this individual needs. So as we learn that this child needs this many breaks, or we learn that this child needs to have this kind of teaching environment, you put that in the IEP. So every year of school, the new teachers can read that IEP, see what kinds of things that child needs, and can adjust their teaching to fit that. So the least restrictive environment is also very important. This is for neurodivergent as well as any other disability. So essentially attempting to include any neurodivergent child within a regular class as much as possible is the best thing. So you could have, say, a special education class. When I was in school, special education, they basically put any kid with disabilities, any kid that was diagnosed with neurodivergent in one classroom, and they had multiple teachers where they could get more individualized attention. And that individualized attention is great, but they didn't have all the socio-emotional opportunities as being mixed with the neurotypical students, or the students who were not in wheelchairs. So mixing these groups together as much as possible is, one, helpful for any child who doesn't have a disability to see and learn how to interact and communicate with people when they have the structure and support of a teacher saying, hey, this is how Jenny or Johnny is communicating. This is how we can learn from them and how we can interact with them. This is what we should watch out for so we don't like make them too stressed or things like that. I mean, obviously that would be really useful for all students to have this kind of individualized education, but this least restrictive environment of trying to incorporate all kids into the learning and in groups is really, really great for socio-emotional development, for their own self-esteem, and their self-efficacy, realizing that they are capable of doing things. Whereas if they're kind of put in their own class and they're never interacting with others, they feel very separate. So definitely an important thing. We will watch this video, one of these videos. I really like the ADHD one, but it's a little longer, but it's probably also because it's really relevant to me. We'll probably watch the first couple minutes of this one and discuss neurodiversity next time. And then we will have an activity which you could get a start on right now. Essentially, do some research on what people with different disabilities and with different neurodivergences excel at. So ADHD, what are things that they can excel at? People with autism, what can they excel at in the world? People with dyslexia, what can they excel at in the world? So that might be something. You don't have to do this in between now and next time, but that will be our group activity. If you wanted to get a head start and work on that, though, that would be great. Sorry, we're over right now, some relevant topics, but I'll let you go. We'll talk about it more next time. Have a great day, and thank you for being here.